Mohamed Salah approached the airline counter expecting nothing more than a routine check-in. But when his request for a flight upgrade was coldly denied, while others around him received special treatment, he found himself at the center of an unspoken injustice. What he did next wasn't out of anger, but out of something far greater. By the end of the flight, the entire crew was in tears. Stay with us until the end, because this is a story you won't forget. Mohamed Salah stepped into the bright, bustling terminal, pulling the hood of his jacket slightly forward. Airports were familiar to him, just another part of the journey, another checkpoint in a life constantly moving. He approached the check-in counter, his boarding pass and passport in hand, offering a polite nod to the agent behind the desk. The woman barely glanced at him. "Next, please," she said, her tone clipped, disinterested. Salah placed his documents on the counter. "I'd like to check if my upgrade request was approved," he said, his voice calm, steady. The woman tapped at her keyboard, her expression blank. A few moments passed before she shook her head. "No upgrades available?" Salah nodded, already accustomed to the unpredictability of travel perks. But as he reached for his documents, something made him pause. Just a few feet away, another passenger, a businessman in a sharp suit, stepped up to a different counter. "Mr. Connors, good news." The other agent beamed. "We have an open seat in first class. Enjoy your flight." Salah's gaze flickered to the interaction, then back to the agent in front of him. He wasn't the type to assume the worst. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe someone else had canceled last minute. But then it happened again. A woman in casual attire carrying a worn-out leather bag approached the desk next to him. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I was wondering if there are any upgrades left." The agent smiled. "Actually, yes." "You're in luck. We just had a seat open up." Salah remained silent, but his chest tightened. He wasn't upset about the seat. He didn't need first class, but something about the pattern unfolding before him felt off. He had enough experience to recognize when something unspoken was happening. The woman at his counter cleared her throat. "Next," she said, without looking up. Salah took his documents and stepped aside. Behind him, an elderly woman, barely 5 feet tall, leaned toward him. "I saw what they did," she murmured. Her voice was soft, but there was something firm in her tone, something that said she had seen far too much of the world to let things slide. Salah gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," he said. She shook her head. "No, dear, it's not." As he walked toward security, he felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had learned long ago that dignity wasn't about where you sat. It was about how you carried yourself, no matter the circumstances. But something told him this flight wasn't going to be as simple as just taking his seat. Salah adjusted the strap of his bag and turned away from the counter without a word. No argument, no protest, just quiet acceptance. It wasn't worth the energy. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't fought with words, but with patience. Still, there was something unsettling about the moment, something that lingered in the air like an unfinished sentence. He walked toward the security checkpoint, his steps unhurried. Around him, travelers moved with purpose, some rushing to catch flights, others dragging tired feet toward distant gates. The airport was a world of its own, full of people coming and going, each with a destination, a purpose, a story. Beside him, the elderly woman from the check-in line caught up. She was small, with silver hair neatly tucked under a hat, her eyes sharp despite her years. She didn't hesitate to speak. "I saw what they did," she murmured, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. Salah glanced at her, the corner of his lips lifting into the smallest of smiles. He wasn't surprised. People like her, those who had lived long enough to recognize injustice in its quietest forms, always noticed. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle. Her face tightened. "No, it isn't." There was something in the way she said it, something firm and unshakable. She had probably seen a lifetime of these moments, people being dismissed, overlooked, treated differently for reasons that were never spoken aloud. Salah exhaled softly. "Some things matter more than seats." The woman studied him for a moment as if weighing his words. Then she nodded, a slow, knowing nod. "You're right," she said, "but dignity matters too. Salah didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because he knew she was right. He had built his life on carrying himself with grace, on proving his worth through actions, not words. Still, there was something about this moment that stayed with him. As they approached security, she patted his arm lightly. "You remind me of my late husband," she said with a small chuckle. "Stubbornly kind, even when he shouldn't be." Salah smiled, genuine this time. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," she said. Then, with one last glance toward the check-in counter, she sighed. "Enjoy your flight, dear, and remember, not everyone who stays quiet is blind." With that, she stepped forward in line, leaving Salah with a thought that stayed with him long after she disappeared into the crowd. Salah stepped onto the plane, nodding politely to the flight attendant at the door. The cool, recycled air carried the scent of leather seats and fresh coffee, a contrast to the sharp, sterile atmosphere of the airport. He moved through the aisle with practiced ease past rows of pristine first-class seats where passengers were already sipping complimentary drinks, adjusting their seats to recline, their jackets neatly hung by the crew. He kept walking. His seat was near the middle of the economy cabin. He slid into the window seat, placing his bag beneath the chair in front of him. The space was tighter, the armrests narrower, the atmosphere noticeably different. He didn't mind. It wasn't the seat that mattered, but the unspoken truth behind how he got here. As he settled in, his gaze drifted forward. The passengers who had received upgrades earlier were now seated comfortably in first class. Each one of them fit a pattern, well-dressed, polished, and similar in one undeniable way. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice unless they were paying attention, but Salah had seen too much of the world to miss it. He turned his head slightly, scanning the rest of economy. Others like him, people who had been at the check-in counter, people who had been told there were no upgrades, sat scattered throughout the cabin. Some were older, some younger, but none of them fit the mold of those up front. A quiet injustice lingered in the air. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead, and a flight attendant moved through the aisle, offering stiff, rehearsed smiles. Salah watched as she stopped at the first-class section, her posture shifting, her tone softening as she leaned in to take a drink order. There was a different energy up there, an unspoken divide that had nothing to do with money. He exhaled slowly, looking out the window. The engines rumbled to life beneath him, the plane, preparing for takeoff. He had faced bigger battles than this. He had played in hostile stadiums, stood on fields where thousands chanted against him. But somehow it was these small, everyday moments of quiet discrimination that left the deepest mark. The plane began its slow roll toward the runway. Salah leaned back in his seat, his fingers loosely interlocked in his lap. He wouldn't say anything. He wouldn't make a scene. But that didn't mean he hadn't noticed. And something told him, before this flight was over, neither would they. Emma smoothed down her uniform and adjusted the tray in her hands, forcing herself to focus. But something about the way the check-in process had unfolded gnawed at her. She had seen it happen before. Subtle, easy-to-miss moments where decisions were made for reasons no one dared to say out loud. And now, as she moved through the first-class cabin, her stomach twisted at the sight of one particular empty seat. It could have been his. She turned to her colleague, a fellow flight attendant who was adjusting the drinks in the galley. Lowering her voice, she leaned in. Why wasn't he upgraded? Her colleague barely looked up. Who? Emma tilted her head toward the economy section. Mohamed Salah. He was on the upgrade list, wasn't he? A hesitant pause. A flicker of discomfort crossed the other attendant's face. I don't know, she said finally. It wasn't our decision. Emma's fingers curled slightly around the tray. That wasn't an answer, it was an excuse. She glanced back toward the economy cabin, her eyes scanning the rows until she found him. Salah sat near the window, his posture relaxed, but his eyes held a quiet awareness. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't drawing attention to himself. But that didn't mean he hadn't noticed. Emma had served plenty of high-profile passengers before. Athletes, celebrities, politicians, people who expected a certain treatment. Some were kind, others entitled. But Salah? She had read about him, watched him in interviews, heard the stories. A man who always carried himself with dignity, who never let ego dictate his actions. And yet, here he was, overlooked while others were ushered into comfort. Her colleague shifted beside her. "Just leave it, Emma. It's not our call." But that was exactly the problem. Emma exhaled slowly, forcing herself to return to her duties, but the unease stayed with her. She knew the game that had been played at the counter, and she knew deep down that the wrong people were the ones making the calls. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady rhythm beneath the quiet conversations, and the occasional chime of the seatbelt sign. The meal service had begun, flight attendants moving through the aisles, placing trays of food in front of passengers with polite, rehearsed smiles. In economy, space was tighter, movements more restricted. But no one complained. It was just how things were. A few rows ahead of Salah, the elderly woman from the airport sat with her meal tray in front of her, her fingers fumbling with the latch. Her hands, wrinkled with age, trembled slightly as she tried to pull the tray down. The latch was stiff, stuck in place. She sighed in frustration, glancing around, but no one seemed to notice. Except him. Salah leaned forward, reaching across the empty seat beside her. "Let me help you," he said gently. His fingers pressed against the mechanism, and with a small click, the tray released, settling into place. The woman looked up, relief and gratitude flickering across her face. "Thank you, dear," she said, smiling warmly. Salah nodded, a quiet smile of his own forming. "Enjoy your meal." She patted his hand briefly before picking up her utensils, content once more. A few rows away, Emma watched. She had been moving through the aisle, distributing drinks. But now she stood frozen for a moment, taking in the small but significant act of kindness. She had seen celebrities on flights before, some demanding, some indifferent, some so disconnected from the world around them that they barely noticed the people serving them. But this was different. There was no arrogance in Salah's actions, no need for recognition. He didn't do it for attention, didn't do it because people were watching. He did it because it was the right thing to do. Emma exhaled slowly, gripping the handle of the drink cart a little tighter. She had a feeling this flight was going to be more important than she had expected. The plane jolted without warning, a sudden, sharp drop that sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Overhead compartments rattled. Plastic cups trembled on tray tables. A collective inhale filled the air, passengers gripping armrests, bracing for whatever came next. Another jolt, then another. The turbulence wasn't violent, but it was persistent, a reminder of just how small they all were in the vast sky. Across the aisle, a young boy clung to his seat, his wide eyes glistening with unshed tears. He couldn't have been older than 5, his small hands gripping the armrest as though it were the only thing keeping him from falling. His mother whispered reassurances, but they weren't enough. His tiny chest heaved, panic setting in. Then a sob escaped. A quiet, choked sound, filled with fear. Salah moved before he even thought about it. He reached across the aisle, his palm open. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. The boy looked up, startled. Salah smiled, warm and steady. "It's just a little wind," he said. "Like riding in a car on a bumpy road." The boy sniffled, still clutching his seat. "I promise we'll be fine," Salah continued. His voice was calm, unshaken. "I've been on so many flights, and they always land safely, every time." For a moment, the boy hesitated. Then slowly, he reached out and took Salah's hand. His grip was small but firm. Salah gave a reassuring squeeze. Another tremor rocked the plane, but this time, the boy didn't cry. Emma watched from a few rows away, a lump forming in her throat. She had seen the exact moment fear left the boy's face, replaced with trust. It wasn't a grand gesture, not something that would make headlines, but it was real. Genuine. Her grip on the drink cart tightened. Because here was a man who had every reason to be angry, every reason to be bitter about the way he had been treated. And yet, all she had seen from him was kindness, and that made her guilt unbearable. Emma had been rehearsing the words in her head for nearly an hour, but as she stepped towards Salah's row, her pulse quickened. Apologizing shouldn't be this hard, and yet there was a weight to it, because deep down she knew she wasn't just saying sorry for herself. She was saying it for every person who had stood by and let moments like this happen. She stopped beside his seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Salah." He looked up, his eyes calm but alert. "Yes?" Emma glanced around, making sure no one was listening, then she leaned in slightly. "I just want to say I'm sorry for what happened at check-in. You deserved better." For a moment, Salah didn't respond. He simply studied her, his expression unreadable. Emma swallowed. Maybe she shouldn't have said anything. Maybe she had overstepped. Then he nodded, his voice gentle but firm. "I appreciate that." She exhaled, relieved. But before she could move away, he spoke again. "But it's not about how I was treated." Emma frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Salah's gaze didn't waver. "It's about how people are treated, even when no one's watching." His words settled deep in her chest, more powerful than she had expected. She had seen it before, how people were treated differently depending on who they were, where they came from, what they looked like. She had never been the one making those choices, but she had been there, watching, letting it happen. Salah didn't need an upgrade, he didn't need validation, but that didn't mean what happened didn't matter. Emma nodded slowly. "You're right." He gave her a small smile, one that didn't need words to carry its meaning. She walked away, her heart heavier than before. Because now, for the first time, she realized, saying sorry wasn't enough. Emma hesitated outside the cockpit door, her fingers curled into a tight fist. She had no obligation to do this. She could have walked away, finished the flight, and let it be just another uncomfortable memory. But something inside her refused to let it go. She took a deep breath and knocked. A few moments later, the door cracked open and the captain, graying at the temples, his uniform crisp and commanding, looked at her with mild curiosity. "Something wrong?" Emma glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was listening. "Captain, I need to talk to you. It's about a passenger." The captain frowned but stepped aside, letting her in. Inside, the hum of the engines was louder, the soft glow of controls illuminating the small space. Emma kept her voice low as she recounted what she had witnessed. The check-in, the quiet dismissal, the pattern of who had been upgraded and who hadn't. She told him about Salah's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. How he had been nothing but gracious, kind, despite the injustice. The captain listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, a silence stretched between them. Then he exhaled slowly. "I don't like this." Emma's chest tightened. "Neither do I." The captain nodded once, decisive. "Thank you for telling me." Emma turned to leave, unsure if she had made a difference. But as she stepped back into the cabin, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice filled the plane, steady and authoritative. "We have a very special guest on board today." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Emma turned toward Salah, who looked up, his brow slightly furrowed. The captain continued, "There are people in this world who remind us that greatness isn't just about talent. It's about character. And we are honored to have one of those people with us today." A pause, then the name. "Mr. Mohamed Salah." The cabin fell silent for a moment. Then a wave of applause swept through the rows. Salah's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he said nothing, only nodding humbly. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. For the first time in the entire flight, something finally felt right. The intercom crackled softly, but the captain's voice came through steady, clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest on board today." The rustling of newspapers stopped. Conversations quieted. Passengers turned their heads, some exchanging puzzled glances. Even the flight attendants froze, their hands hovering over meal trays, their expressions caught between confusion and curiosity. Salah barely reacted. His fingers rested loosely on his armrest, his gaze flickering up toward the speaker as the captain continued. "There are people in this world who remind us that greatness isn't just about talent. It's about character. It's about how we treat others, even when no one is watching, and today we are honored to have one of those people with us." The tension in the cabin shifted. A different kind of energy rippled through the air, curiosity turning into realization. The name dropped like a stone in water. Mr. Mohamed Salah. Silence. A beat. Then applause. It started hesitantly, one or two passengers clapping, but it grew quickly, swelling, rolling through the cabin like a wave. Some cheered, others turned to Salah, their expressions shifting from indifference to admiration. Emma swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. She wasn't the only one. A few of the crew members subtly wiped at their faces, their usual professional detachment cracking under the weight of the moment. Salah didn't stand. He didn't raise a hand or soak in the attention like so many others would have. He simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, his humility more powerful than any speech could have been. He hadn't asked for recognition. He hadn't demanded respect. And yet, in this moment, it had found him anyway. The wheels touched down with a soft screech, the plane shuddering as it slowed along the runway. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the cabin, some passengers stretching, others reaching for their phones, already returning to the distractions of the world below. Salah remained still, his hands resting on his lap, his mind somewhere else. He had never been one to dwell on moments like these, on gestures of recognition or applause. Respect wasn't something you asked for, it was something you carried within you. As the seatbelt sign blinked off, the aisles filled with movement. Overhead bins creaked open. The usual impatience of deplaning took over, people eager to return to their lives. Salah reached for his bag, preparing to join the quiet exodus. Then a familiar voice stopped him. "Mr. Salah?" Emma stood before him, her hands clasped together, her usual professional demeanor softened by something more genuine. "There's a seat waiting for you in first class on your next flight," she said with a small smile. "On us." Salah met her eyes, seeing the sincerity there. The offer wasn't about compensation. It wasn't about fixing what had happened. It was about acknowledgement, about trying, however late, to do the right thing. For a moment, he considered it. Then he shook his head, his voice as steady as ever. "Give it to someone who really needs it." Emma's lips parted slightly as if to protest, but she stopped herself. There was nothing to argue. This was who he was. Salah slung his bag over his shoulder and gave her one last nod before stepping into the aisle, disappearing into the slow-moving crowd. He left behind no demands, no expectations, only a lesson. That true greatness is never measured by where you sit, but by how you stand.